quorum, and so I call to order this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Agriculture and Forestry. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you here. I'd like to begin by welcoming members of the committee and those watching, and our witnesses, and those watching on the web. My name is Rob Black, Senator from Ontario, and I'm the chair of the committee. Today, the committee is meeting on its to continue its study to examine and report on the status of soil health in Canada. And before we hear from our witnesses, I'd like to start by having these senators introduce themselves around the table. Senator Simons.
Good morning. I'm Senator Paula Simons from Alberta, Treaty 6 territory.
Good morning. Sharon Bury, Senator from Ontario.
Good morning and welcome to our guest this morning, Marty Klein, Senator from Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory.
Bonjour, c'est Chantal Petitclerc, sénatrice du Québec.
Colin Deacon from Nova Scotia.
Wonderful. Before we begin, I again remind you that should there be any technical challenges arising as we go through the meeting, particularly in relation to interpretation, please signal to the chair or the clerk and we'll work to resolve the issue. And if we have to suspend for a time, we will. Today, our first panel, we welcome from Carbon Terra, Jason Mann, Chief Executive Officer, and Rachel Hoare, Chief Operating Officer. And from Carbon RX Incorporated, we have Marty Seymour, Chief Executive Officer. I'll invite you to make your presentations, and we'll begin with Mr. Mann and Ms. Orr, who will be delivering a joint statement on behalf of Carbon Terra, followed by Mr. Seymour from Carbon RX. You'll have 5 minutes each, and when we get down to about a minute, I'll put one hand up, and when we get down to close to the 5 minutes, you should be thinking about wrapping it up. So, Mr. Mann, take it away.
Well, actually, Rachel, I'm sorry. We'll start with it.
Take it away.
All right, thank you. Good morning, Honorable Chair, and to all the senators, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll just kick into the statement that I would like to make. So Carbon Terra is a wholly Canadian organization comprising of distinguished leaders in soil sciences globally. So our aim is to establish a climate-friendly, carbon-neutral agricultural ecosystem that improves a farmer's return on investment in sustainable farming practices. Today, I want to address the vital topic of carbon sequestration and express my belief in Canada's potential to lead the way in driving change. Climate change poses significant challenges to our planet, impacting our environment, climate, and future. Carbon sequestration plays a crucial role in combating climate change with nature-based solutions like no-till farming, bearing very highly effective outcomes. No-till farming involves growing crops without disturbing the soil, resulting in numerous benefits such as reduced soil erosion, improved soil health and air quality, and increased water retention. Notably, no-till farming has the ability to sequester carbon by increasing soil organic matter. Conversely, tilling the soil releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. Research indicates that no-till farming in the Canadian prairie can sequester up to 1.5 million tons of carbon per acre per year. Scaling up the adoption of no-till farming across 153 million acres of annual cropland in the 3 prairie provinces could have significant impact, sequestering approximately 138 million tons of carbon annually. This amount of carbon sequestration is equivalent to the emissions of over 112 million gasoline-powered passenger vehicles for a year. The potential of carbon sequestration through no-till farming on Canadian croplands is thus substantial. Incentivizing sustainable practices through carbon credits is pivotal for enhancing the sustainability of our current system and achieving climate goals. Carbon credits allow businesses and individuals to offset carbon emissions by investing in projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. While carbon credits have played a role in various sectors, including agriculture, the current system does not fully recognize the contributions of no-till farming. Early adopters of no-till practices are disadvantaged due to the technical definition of additionality and permanence. To address this, Canada should lead by recognizing the contribution of early adopters of no-till farming and set an example globally. Engagement in no-till carbon sequestration is not limited to producers alone. Consumers have a role to play. By supporting producers who implement sustainable farming practices like no-till farming, consumers can contribute to adoption of these methods. Policymakers are urged to provide incentives and funding for producers who have already demonstrated the benefits of sustainable farming. This collaborative effort can drive the recognition of no-till farming with carbon credits incentivizing its adoption, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and mitigating climate change's effects. Ultimately, this approach benefits the environment, fosters a sustainable and profitable agricultural sector, and aids Canada in achieving its climate goals and promises. Our current dilemma is really supporting and acknowledging the early adopters of no-till farming through policy recognition, and it's vital for encouraging more producers to adopt this sustainable agricultural practice. These pioneers have embraced sustainable farming methods that benefits both the environment and society, and they have demonstrated long-lasting carbon stock availability, and scientific evidence affirms that there's always room for improvement. To avoid putting early adopters at disadvantage or penalizing them, I'd like to mention that when I use the word penalize here is referring to an unrewarded good husbandry that has been demonstrated in the forefront of Canadian farming. Policy should refrain from indirect penalization through the absence of this specific procedure. Historically, agriculture policies have often incentivized and penalized producers based on short-term outcomes, which is detrimental to those that have invested considerable time, money, and resources in transitioning to this practice of no-till farming. So, I actually have quite a bit more to go. But I'm out of time. So I like to stress that, policy is truly the issue. And I would like to say that policy revision is a necessity to acknowledge the valuable contribution of these early adopters of no-till farming to sustainable agriculture and carbon sequestration. And I have a list of reasons that I would like to share to alter and recognize all these individuals, because we need to encourage the wider adoption of sustainable practice. And by acknowledging this and rewarding them with their efforts of early adoption of no-till farming, policy will motivate the producer to transition to adopt other sustainable farming practices.
When I get to my question, I'll ask you what that list is.
Sounds good.
And we'll allow you to then
That
say
will be super awesome.
All right?
So,
So we need to wrap up 5 minutes. So I don't know, Mr. Mann,
Yes.
you're not going to have a chance to say anything. So hopefully in your questions,
Sure.
maybe one of my colleagues can ask a question that might satisfy. So I'm going to move to Mr. Seymour. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, respected senators. As the CEO of CarbonRx, a Canadian carbon credit origination streaming carbon credit company with our origins dating back to 2006, so that first generation of carbon crediting in Canada, we're certainly grateful to have the opportunity here to speak with you all today. So to set the table, I think we can and should stand proud of the work our Canadian farm and food system does to ensure the long-term sustainability of our land and our food system. We need to stay disciplined and ensure carbon remains a vehicle to measure and manage soil health and not become a weapon for change. I want to hit on a few key themes that we can unpack in more detail in the Q&A, and I think it'll complement what you heard from my colleagues here. First theme is measuring, and as much as carbon's a climate play, I actually think carbon's a data play. And it's really a hot mess of data and source quality, to be honest with you. Soil testing methodologies seem to also drive some of the confusion. Standardizing and simplifying what's required is a really good place to start. Conversely, standardizing land characteristics is a challenge. So the variability of land characteristics overlaid with 100 years of individual practices makes generalization of soil carbon a serious challenge. The second one is adoption of technology, and it's relatively mixed in this space. I'm a big fan of remote sensing and using satellites, for example, but not everyone is aligned with me on the ability to do this from a quality and quantity standpoint in terms of carbon. And what I see is the pursuit of perfection is getting in the way of progress on this topic of technology. The last piece is around leakage, and I think leakage is a great carbon term. It's an important principle that applies specifically to the Canadian food system. Canadian cattle and grain production would be really good examples of an opportunity of proper land use related to low carbon footprint models. And we have to be careful not to regulate our producers out of business and defer production to other countries where places like subsistence rice farming or cattle in a rainforest area would have a much higher carbon intensity. So we need to think in terms of intensity as much as net zero when it comes to measuring carbon footprints in this country. It honestly puts Canada as a preferred trading partner in many cases. So maybe in order to drive some of the Q&A and the conversation, I thought I'd hit on the role of government or how I see government can help in this one. And firstly is to facilitate the growth of the voluntary carbon market. It might be counterintuitive that the government would help support the voluntary market, but the voluntary market allows private sector money to flow into the Canadian food system. It's a great vehicle to help finance and move producers along that change curve. The federal and provincial government carbon schemes actually create market confusion. And global buyers want nature-based carbon credits, which Canada is rich in, and agriculture and forestry offer this great unique opportunity for carbon removal, as you heard from my colleague Rachel. Second one is invest in protocol development. I think this part of the industry is underfunded. It moves super slow and it's expensive. Carbon protocols is the recipe for how we're going to measure and manage, and it costs a lot for the private sector to bring those to market. The other one is additionality, and I was really pleased to hear about my colleagues' comments around additionality and the opportunity there. This is rather provocative, but I think the government can set the bar on when the additionality principle starts. And I've been a huge advocate of suggesting that day zero for how we farm should start at the Paris Accord, December of 2015. All practices beyond 2015 signing of that accord would, for me, be the baseline for a net zero. I'm happy to chat more about that. The other one is add water. When you're from Saskatchewan, we talk a lot about water and irrigation, and if you think about improving soil health and organic matter and sustainability, anchoring it in water in these drier climates, particularly in the west where we're from, is another role the government could play to facilitate soil enhancement. And then the last piece around this, that I'm not clear where the government sits on this or how the government can help, but I want to see this idea, is that sustainable financing and Scope 3 emissions are going to be the sleepers and the big disruptors on carbon in the carbon markets. So further thoughts needed here on the role of government in terms of sustainable financing and how banks are regulated, and in addition to that, Scope 3 emissions and how we're going to track and manage. So in closing, the government's going to set the weather when it comes to the important issues attached to climate change, but it's actually the landowners that hold the power when it comes to the execution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we'll proceed with questions from the senators, and we'll start with our vice chair. But before asking and answering questions, I'd like to remind folks to be careful with the microphone and refrain from leaning in too close in case it affects the sound system and the folks that are interpreting for us today. I'd like to remind each senator that you have 5 minutes, and that's including the questions and the answers, and we'll go through at least a couple of rounds. We have until about 5 to 10 for this panel. So we'll start with Senator Simons.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Some of my colleagues on this committee are members of the Banking Committee, and one of them is a member of the National Finance Committee. I am not. So I wondered if, in order to set up a carbon market that actually returns value to farmers, that a credit is worth something, that it's tradable, that it's backed by value. It seems to me like if we have a bunch of little voluntary markets, it's mostly just a good conduct flag that we're trading back and forth. So how do we set up an actual, is the phrase fiat backed? Is that what I'm looking for, banker guys? A credible carbon market that is, that you can prove that you deserve the credit because you actually have sequestered the carbon and it's actually in the ground and you've done the mapping and the testing to prove that. But B, that my carbon credit I can sell to Senator Deakin, and Senator Deakin can sell it to Senator Petitclerc. Senator Petitclerc can sell it to Senator Burry, and that it's not just like a gold star. It's actually something that has value, which will then encourage people to adopt the practices.
Was there a question there?
Yeah, do you have to set up something that is traded like a stock exchange, like a commodity? I mean, how do we make this something that isn't just patting ourselves on the back?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. I think there's a tripwire in setting this up for our industry we need to be mindful of. And I learned this early on as, you know, I used to work for a federal crown agency, and so I had a real bias to Canada first and in the Canadian-centric ecosystem. And I jumped in the carbon space and realized that it's an international market. And so a made-in-Canada solution from a voluntary standpoint is something we got to be super careful about. If we want to just trade domestically and we set up a registry, I'll call it a voluntary registry, we may limit ourselves to only Canada. So we got to think about how does that adjudication and verification process give us international exposure so that I can trade. That's where the big trades are happening. So I leave that first thought. I'm actually proud to be working on one of the solutions to this, which is it's a longer story, but building a new registry that's owned and managed by the industry. And when I say the industry, I steal a best practice I watched the cattle industry do when they built the Sustainable Roundtable. And McDonald's, Cargill, and the Canadian cattlemen got together and said, hey, we need to set the definition of sustainability that McDonald's could now create a brand and market that. So fast forward 10 years later, and that ecosystem of companies includes Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife, the accounting firms, the banks, everyone's participating. And so the industry got together and said, this is what constitutes sustainable beef. I think we can do the same in carbon. I think an industry-owned and industry-driven carbon economy, and I don't mean Canadian industry only, I'm talking about international partners and members as well. So once again, you have to think beyond our borders. Yeah, I'll stop there, I think, on that point and maybe give some room to my colleagues.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, this voluntary versus compliant. And, we have a lot of debate on is voluntary going to drive the changes into compliance credits or vice versa. And we spent the last couple of years dealing with some of these voluntary markets, and it's a tough because it's an ever-changing landscape, and it's really hard to really set a path forward because you just don't know the rules. So developing something that could be, I would say, endorsed by the federal government, whether it's on a voluntary or compliant, would be just a great tool to start putting, where you can put something here that's fungible, that you can say this credit has a value, and even if it starts to trade in Canada and then can be adopted globally.
You've got a minute. You've got a minute.
Yeah. So that's what we'd like to see is we need the federal government and to work with the provinces instead of this mishmash of the one province wants to do this and the feds want to do something else. We really need a coherent system that we can almost bank on, where we can say, okay, well, now we have a path. Let's build something. Because right now we're just guessing. We're trying to steer it, but we're just a small company. We need the government to step in and take some leadership.
If it's not fungible, if it's not backed by anything, then it's just the new Bitcoin, right? I mean, it has to have an enduring market value. Otherwise, people aren't going to invest, because what are they buying except a participation certificate to put on their fridge?
Right. So do you peg it to the Canadian dollar, the U.S. dollar, or do you peg it to, or you just leave it as a bid offer? I'm not sure on that, because the market's the market, I think, in some ways. But I think the market will grow if you've got some backing behind it and people have the confidence in it. And if it's sponsored, then people aren't worried that it's some kind of greenwashing or something like that. This is a legitimate credit. And they are legitimate, and that's the thing. So we need that kind of support.
Mr. Seymour, you've got a couple points, but briefly.
Back it with a methodology that support, if you would look for the role of government, a methodology, a testing mechanism, and maybe validation. And we have a system in Western Canada in crop insurance that might be a tool or an agent that starts to give that backing credibility you might be chasing.
And we'll put you on second round.
Please, yeah.
We have Senatrice Petitclerc followed by Senator Klein. Senatrice Petitclerc.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais poser...
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to ask my question in French, so I'll give you time to put on your earbuds.
And you can, of course, answer in the language of your choice. Ms. Hoare, you talked about the people who adopted these practices first, the early adopters, and other witnesses have told us that they have to be recognized and they have to be encouraged. So my question was really to wonder whether those who adopted these best practices, first of all, and these early adopters, we've heard a lot about them because from a definite number of witnesses. And is that okay, the interpretation? Are you getting it? Yes. And so my question is a simple one. What can we do? Because everyone says that there's a problem and they're the early adopters, but what can we do more? Have to go back and start over, or do we have to find some way of compensating or rewarding these early adopters?
So
Who wishes? Yeah, go ahead.
So I like to comment on that one. Thank you, Senator. I think what we really don't recognize here right now is early adopters in Canada is truly unique, and we are in the forefront of Canadian farming, and people actually look up to us. And we are also climatically very fortunate. That's why it allowed us to farm the way we farm, and therefore we don't till. And we are now sitting on really a carbon sink, and I'm sad to say that we're not doing anything about it because the eligibility of what's being recognized is just not there. And what we are advocating here is to perhaps come to a time to say that, hey, maybe it's 20 years ago that we should start recognizing this because we're already doing the right thing. Or maybe, as my colleague just mentioned, Paris Accord recorded 2015, and that should be the time that we should start taking into consideration. But I think what's really pivotal here is to say that, hey, farmers, I know you've been doing the right thing. We can't roll back for the last 2 decades, but because we started recognizing all the climatic changes and we've been recording this in the Paris Accord, maybe 2015 will be a good cutoff date. And the reality is, I want to touch on permanence. Everybody argues about permanence, and when it comes to nature-based, I would say that we have the best permanence. If we have been doing this for the last 2-3 decades, and we have been storing this, and we have quantified all the carbon sink that we have, why are we even arguing about permanence? We are sitting on it, we're standing on it, we're breathing it, we're living it. And therefore, I would say that there's no argument about the sciences because it's showing itself. And it comes to about the value and how it's backed. That's where I think we are showing and demonstrating how we're backing it with Canadian farming. And this is where we should really stand up and say that we should lead the stage of carbon. And I always get so passionate about this when I talk about permanence and additionality because we don't understand it and people don't see it. Science is there, but nobody is really reading into it. And we're standing on it, and we are so fortunate to be Canadians here. So therefore, I strongly say that no-till should be recognized, should be looked back at. It maybe it's 2015, maybe it's 2010, but this will help farmers propel into all other additionality. Because if they're not recognized, how are they going to be funding all these things? It's not cheap to buy an equipment. It's not cheap to adopt all these technologies. Farmers are fearful. If I change anything, what's going to happen to me? But if you say that, I know you've done good, I have confidence in you, and I'm using this confidence and reinvesting in regenerative farming, then it's going to work. So, sorry, I get so excited about this.
Hard to see your passion.
We like it.
If I could just add, is it okay?
Yeah, very quick.
The policies are plagued with, what have you done for me lately? That's the problem. What have you done for me lately? And so, we need the carrot and the stick. And yes, there needs to be improvement. Yes, there needs to be more adoption. Yes, we need to improve the wetlands, and we need to, do cover crops and more grasslands and take marginal land out of production. And yes, we need to have a better use of fertilizer. But let's reward for what's been done. you know, it's not just what have you done for me lately, and I think that's the issue, how farmers look at it and go, wow. So, I'd just like to have that.
Very, very quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There might be an opportunity here to explore around avoided conversion. It's something you apply in forestry. So I'm not going to cut the trees down, or in grazing, I'm not going to plow the dirt. I'm not clear how long we need to be zero-tilling to say that is the standard, but it's generally accepted that's the standard. So if we've been zero-tilling in Saskatchewan for 20 years, and we agree that we will not convert that land to tilled land, there may be a carbon conversation in that. It's a nuance in the recipe. We've been so focused on rewarding for the practice, maybe we're missing an obvious one to say, wait a minute, if we don't convert and release 20 tons of carbon, that's a carbon credit by definition.
Thanks, Mr. Seymour. Moving on to Senator Klein, followed by Senator Deakin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you're as generous with time, because I get the sense we probably could use another hour on this one. But I'd like to get a question in both, but we'll see what we can do. Maybe I need to go on second round. But first question, back to, while you're on a roll there, I'd just like to go back to the comment that policy is really the issue. And just on that note, what's the message for policymakers that we should be delivering in terms of incentives for the early adopters of no-tilling, incentives to adopt new technology? We've got incentives for electric vehicles, and perhaps we should have incentives for new technologies to be employed in the area of the where the Canadian farmers can be seen as the leaders. And I got the sense that that potential is globally to be held out as that. So policy makers, incentives, and the absence of that, I agree, is a form of penalizing. And that being the sense, also the accelerator lane, how do we get them into the accelerator lane to make up 2 or 3 decades that have been missed? And is no-till, as you described it, carbon sequestration and no-till farming is a good climate change best practice. Is that good for all regions? Does one size fit all, or are there some regions where the soils are not necessarily adaptable to no-till farming and need to have some regular till? Oh, you're on a roll with it before, so I just want to get you to back on the band here.
So I think there are a few questions there. I'd like to address the last one first in terms of, does one method of farming apply for all? The answer is, I would say yes and no. No, because of course, certain climatic situation or, soil condition probably does not encourage as much of no-tilling as we would like to. But there's something called min-tilling that they can still apply. And that would also enable an adoption of another sustainable farming practice, right? So the thing is, people need to, again, invest to try. So that's, again, another angle that we need to look at. In terms of, all these technologies that is made available there, it's again, to encourage farmers to adopt this, they need to have that comfort to take onto them. And therefore now we're seeing all these other encouragement that are coming from, even, the financial services are now offering, lending on sustainable farming. And that's another angle that is, allowing them to do so. But I think, again, there is not any policies or encouragement that is put in place to say, hey, farmer, you know what? We're not going to penalize you in any shape or form because you're doing it not right for the first year. Because normally in the first year when you adopt any change, it's not going to instantaneously show you that you're going to get that results that you want. But we are always constantly, expecting immediate results. And even with carbon, it's all sequestered over time. And here we are, looking at immediate change, and we're saying that we have to measure year on year of additionality, and it doesn't work like that because the reality is sciences and nature does work its own way, and we have to allow time to prove itself. So to me is, carbon stocks that are in the ground needs to be measured over time, but it's not like, you're going to measure every now and then and see that, right?
Okay, could I, just quick question while we're running
Yeah.
out of time here. You'd mentioned, and I maybe never captured the whole thing, but on carbon credits, it doesn't recognize no-till. And
Right,
so
yeah.
is there a policy change needed there?
Currently, there is no policy, but because there is no policy, it becomes an ineligibility for anybody. And this is how it's already casted globally. And, all these registries that are in, where the 4 big registries globally, they don't have anything that actually allows any participation in that shape or form. And, Canada being Canada, sometimes we kind of just copy and paste, and then we're just listening to what people are doing, and we're not doing our own thing. But we are just different. We are special.
I think the direct answer is, though, yes, there does need to be a policy change, and yes, the government does need to recognize soil carbon sequestration. Absolutely. We could be leaders in that if we started with that, because we are the leaders. We're the leaders in Mintail. We did it because, I farmed starting back in the 80s, and, we had droughts in Western Canada. The ditches were full of dirt. The grasshoppers were mowing down the crop. We changed to Mintail and zero-till because of the climate. But now we're saying, well, you can't be rewarded for that because you had a benefit from that. But we really need to reward farmers for taking that innovation, and that innovation is being transplanted around the world. It's in Australia, it's in Ukraine.
Senator Klein, we're going to add your name to the second round. Perfect. We have Senator Deakin followed by Senator Bury.
So don't worry, I'm going to pick up where you just left off. Canada still has the world's most important mining and minerals investment conference every year in Toronto. I have a dream that perhaps someday we will have a carbon market that attracts that level of attention globally. And the fact that we are not taking on that challenge and opportunity is a source of immense frustration for me, and I think perhaps for others around this table. I'll speak just for myself. Every interaction I've had with officials at AAFC and advisors to the minister have left me frustrated because they are not reflecting what we hear from scientists and from people on the ground and from farmers as to what is possible here and the amount of time that we can buy in fighting climate change if Canada were to become a global leader in exporting the technology and know-how around the world to have markets that had trust. So, yes, government-backed policies and methodology with an opportunity to take advantage of a world opportunity and world crisis need right now. So, let's get very specific on the things that need to be changed. I'll start with you, if I could, Mr. Seymour. And we need specific advice because I think there's a lot of shared frustration about the fact that we are just leaving this opportunity behind. We're saying, somebody else do it. We're not courageous enough. We don't believe in it.
Okay, that's a big question, Senator, and wise. Two thoughts come to mind. First one is this conversation is more than just AAFC. This is ECCC as well, and it would extend beyond. But advice directly to that is collectively the departments aligning on outcome-based decisions. So collectively, those departments need to share the same vision. I'm not convinced they do. I couldn't give you an example. I'm just using the easy answer to not get deep in the weeds. And then I think your other decision is do you want to do this through a compliance mechanism or through a voluntary mechanism? And I love the compliance mechanism because the economics look really good, but the compliance mechanism is slow. And so if you want to move at the speed of business, then a voluntary mechanism, and perhaps the government actually plays a role in establishing a voluntary market, because my desire would be to trade those credits internationally. That's super important to me because the market in Canada, we're sitting on a ton of nature-based credits with a limited buyer pool simply based on the size of our economy. So I'll stop there as just two potential things to explore.
Senator Deakin, were you looking for?
Yes, yes. I just wanted to start with Mr. Seymour.
Well, I think we do need to set up an exchange. We should be the global leaders in this. We really are. Going back 30 years or longer, we are the leaders in nature-based. And quite frankly, the other countries are eating our lunch. Why is Singapore, of all places, they're just way out in front of us, Temasek Group and Standard Chartered Bank. They're out there setting up these nature-based exchanges. It's happening all over the place in countries that have a landmass of what? The size of, the size of Southwest Ontario. What are we doing? This is our domain. We should be leading it, like Senator Deakin says. I'd love to see where we have this. We are the go-to place. We are the go-to conference. We have the exchange that globally people trust. Government back it and let's get on with it.
And don't penalize farmers for the carbon they use and not reward them for the carbon they sequester.
There's so much more the farmers could be doing and would do. They need some guidance. All they hear about is, oh my gosh, there's carbon credits coming from Ottawa. That's what they think. They don't understand all the opportunities that are here. Yeah, they see it from the benefit of min-till and better utilization of inputs and whatnot. But there's so much more that could be done if we just empower them.
Here. Anything else, Ms. Hoare, before the other hand
We
goes
have
up?
1 minute.
No, I echo, both my colleagues here, and I really hope that, we are at the right platform to voice our frustrations. And, Senator Deakin, you spoke my heart, and I think I've spoken to a lot of senators here, and I hope today I'm really heard together with my colleagues here, because we are here to really change this, and we are, with the technology, we've built all this. We just need a little bit of push to the envelope, and we need the backing to make that happen, right? Thank you.
Someday I want to find out why there is this barrier, because it is nonsensical. So, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Bury.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for all this passion. I just love it. I come from another field, but I think there could be lessons from other fields. So I heard from many, I would say mainly government officials, saying that early adopters, when they adopt early, they gain the benefits of increased production. So they've just, that's it. That's what, first of all, what would you say to that statement that, you've already got increased production over time? Why should we reward you for that?
So I guess your question is very much on the public benefit versus the private benefit. And a lot of times, it's argued that early adopters are actually doing this because of a private benefit. And I would then refer to the statement that Jason just made, right? Is again, what are you doing for me today? And at the end of the day, we all know that no-till farming would have been a carbon sink for all of us. We didn't know that. Did they actually know that no-till farming was going to create that kind of yield? Similarly, they did not know that. So I would argue that everybody had one intention, was to actually do something, yes, for their own good. But right now, we have done all this research and all these findings over time to say that, hey, you've done all the good, and now we are continually doing all the good for all other geography. And why are we then penalizing ourselves that we founded this, and that, other people are then learning from us, and then they get to do all the good, and then we are not doing anything for ourselves, and then we're sitting on this.
It's going to run out, so I'm sorry, Rachel, because I have another question.
Yeah.
Marty, I saw you twiddling your fingers. Are you wanting to jump in there? Or?
Yeah.
Thank you. So kind, Senator. Yeah, very much so. As you can tell, I have a thought on many topics. And so we're on we keep banging around on the additionality principle, and that's the core of carbon, and that's when it depends on which side of the pendulum you're on. If you're a buyer, if I'm talking to a buyer, they generally want carbon removal.
Yeah.
And if you're talking to a seller, they would like to get credit for all the good that they've done for 20 years, and there's an inherent tension in that. And that tension's okay, but that's really what we're battling. And so we have to choose which side of the ledger we want to address. I don't know if we can address both at the same time. But that's an important distinction for me. Is, are we trying to satisfy the buyer or the seller? One of the ways that I would try to sell or satisfy the buyer in this case is co-benefits. And to speak to your point about, I made the change for the productivity lift. Sure, that's great. That's how the farming system was really structured. The co-benefit is, and I captured carbon, and I created jobs in my community, and I did these other things. And so we're probably not celebrating the co-benefits of some of these changes. And it's very clear, my friends here at Carbon Terra have said, it's, the dollars per acre that farmers are receiving are minimal. The additionality principle says the money has to change a behavior. That's the simplest. So if $1 doesn't change the behavior, $1 per acre, then how do we move that dollar to 2 to 3 to 4? My theory is we get better at measuring so we can demonstrate more carbon per acre. That's part of the equation. Drive the price of carbon up is the other one to pull more money in. The only third lever that I can think of is that the government tops that up. And there's some programming that exists today. It's not going to cover the industry, but that's the formula.
Do we have time for one more? Okay, well, maybe I'll come around if we don't finish. So just jumping on what you said there, Marty, about, the additionality principle and making sure that people are aware. I'm thinking from markets such as, how people jumped on, getting organic farming and buying organic. I think that there is a huge gap in knowledge in our consumer base. And I want to know, you can answer later, how you're dealing with that and any strategies that you could tell us about, and then what we could do to act on that. Okay, thank you. Okay, I think
So, I have a question, and then we'll move to Senators Cotter and Duncan. We may not get around to round two, colleagues. What we will ask you, though, is you can ask your question, and you have the opportunity to submit written briefs to those questions. So if we don't get to round two, I will at least ask you to state your question. My question is, you mentioned 4 or 5 items in your opening brief. Can you be very brief on what those 4 or 5, the list of things you wanted to make sure we knew about in your opening brief? I'm not sure we got to those. 4 or 5 things you said I want to leave with you.
So I think the first one is very much touching on the policy. It's really allowing a mechanism to encourage wider adoption of sustainable practice. I think we have covered that quite a bit. I think in promoting the mitigation of climate change, we are actually setting a lot of impedance here with how we are acting towards the whole ecosystem. And the other thing that is also in my notes is really addressing equity concerns, which is recognizing early adopters of no-till farming is actually addressing the equity issue that is prevalent in agriculture sector, because all this significant investment of time, money, and resources to transition needs to be recognized to foster continuous adoption of other sustainable and regenerative farming methods that could actually be pricey in terms of how we are looking at it. And I think the other thing is the technology part that Marty talked about, which, again, right now with the current structure of how we are measuring carbon, it's again not very enticing, and we spend so much money with boots on the ground saying that we have to keep testing and testing and testing every single patch of soil, and that actually erodes what the farmers are actually going to be paid with, right, in terms of the carbon credit. So all this methodology and sciences are there, but we are ignoring it. If you look at all the research that is there, people are already moving away from satellite imagery, and people are already moving away from remote sensing, and people are already diving into other things. And here we are struggling, saying that, we still need boots on the ground and lab tests. And that's just insane, because when you can do it with lower costs and be scalable and deploy that and put money back into the pocket of the farmers, we're not doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was my question. Senator Cotter, followed by Senator Duncan.
excuse me, first apologies for missing your presentations in the early part of the questioning. I have benefited from conversations with Rachel and Jason in the past, so I have a fairly good idea of the perspectives they would bring. My apologies more, I think, with respect to you, Mr. Seymour. Mine is a bit less of a question and maybe more of a statement. A lot of this discussion, and sometimes inspired by interventions from Senator Deakin, feels like on the question of early adopters, kind of the story of the prodigal son that Senator Simon sometimes refers to, and in the sense that all kinds of people doing good achieve the same kind of reward as the person who comes along at the 11th hour and we all get to heaven. I think, is that how it goes, something like that? And you know, it's frustrating in the sense that we forget about all the other sons and daughters who have been living a good life right up till then and contributing up until then, and they tend to be no better off. And secondly, there is a kind of a disincentive to be bold in early adoption here, not just in this area, but in almost other walks of life where government has a voice. Why would we take risks at the beginning when we'll let somebody else do it and we'll end up in the same spot and maybe better off? So it's a comment, but I'd invite your reflection on that. Maybe Rachel first, and Jason and Marty.
And you have 3 minutes and 30 seconds for the three of you.
It resonates with us. It's this whole "what have you done for me lately" policy madness, I think. And you know, when you were asked, Senator Black, about the things that we want a made in Canada registry. You know, we're relying on Vera and CAR and Gold Standard, and we need a made in Canada registry that reflects what we value as Canadians, and we can lead with that. You know, we need the government backing to give it credibility. I think we do need an exchange. I think we made a made in Canada exchange. Why let Singapore do it? We should be doing it here. We have the nature-based credits. We're just exporting it like every other commodity. Let's add the value here, right? And we absolutely have to recognize this historical mintail. We have to do that if we want farmers to adopt more and empower them to do more. We have to recognize that mintail, whether we go back to 2015 or to 2010. You know, we can pick an arbitrary date, but we just have to do that. And because farmers are investing money, and just like to buy a new air seeder to do this kind of mintail, it's $1 million. Who's going to pay for that? You know, they expect to make it off the price of canola. You know, there's other things there. You know, I represent thousands of farmers across Canada that we're investing in building a new nitrogen plant. And you know, there's a big target on nitrogen because of its emissions. But you know, we're looking at building a plant with green ammonia. You know, these are the things that farmers are doing to be proactive. You know, they're putting up seed capital money to do all the engineering and design work, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, to try and improve the use of fertilizer because there's a big target on nitrogen's back, and farmers are scared. Oh, you're going to make me use less nitrogen. Well, I don't think we need to use less nitrogen. We need to use it smarter. But to use it more smarter, then you got to produce a better quality product, and you have to have the equipment to apply it. This all takes money. So we got to find the rewards for them so they can get paid for the good things they're doing so that they can reinvest it, because the farmer will reinvest it. We know that. That's where they like to spend their money. They like to spend it on their farm and improve their farm. So I think every dollar we spend passes Main Street 7 times, I think they say. So let's invest in Canada, invest in our farmers.
Mr. Seymour offer a reflection?
Maybe offer a new thought around this to build off of that is I think Scope 3 emissions and sustainable financing might be a tool to look at here. And so Scope 3 opens the door for supply chains leaning into farmers. And so if you've been mintilling for a long time and capturing carbon, your Scope 3 value chain would see monetary value in that. It'll show up in different ways. But I think in industry we need to explore that. I think Scope 3 is an absolute dumpster fire in terms of accounting and being able to track, but there's something in there. And then sustainable financing tools is another way to reward growers to say, if you've been doing this practice, there's a couple examples in market from some of the lenders where they're incentivizing practices that have been validated, not new practices, you're doing them and validating. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much. We now move on to Senator Duncan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and my sincere apologies for being late this morning and missing part of your presentation. Thank you for your passion that you bring to this. I'm very interested in your comments regarding made in Canada. First of all, I'm from the Yukon. We're not known for our farming or no-till. We are melting permafrost releasing a fair amount of carbon into the air. And that led me to the Made in Canada idea that you had. And is there any mechanism that we could move this to a whole of Canada approach by government? Too often we see one size fits all in their policies and it doesn't work across the country. So my question is, could we do something, carbon credits that would apply throughout the country? And how do we bump this to encourage some federal-provincial cooperation? Federalism has got to be the most difficult style of government, but if we could somehow have the carbon credits achieved in Saskatchewan apply to northern Canada or the western Canada, we've got problems elsewhere, northwestern Canada, put it that way. That's my question. Could we have a Made in Canada solution that would apply to the whole country for carbon credits? Do you see that? And is there a suggestion you have for bumping this to the Council of Federation discussions?
I'll start. I think my colleague recommending a national registry, and I'm thinking a voluntary registry in this case, is one way. I would discourage standardizing or gifting carbon credits to all people that operate similarly. So if everybody, we exported this out in Saskatchewan, everybody would get credit for zero till. It actually diminishes the value of the credit. So when I go to sell that on the market, it's the standard. And so the buyers on the other side would devalue. It doesn't mean they have no value, but there's something inside of that tension that needs to be definitely considered, that if we made the Yukon and Prince Edward Island standardized carbon story, I'm not convinced how liquid those credits are outside of the country. We haven't tested it, but I have a hypothesis that if everybody gets it, it has less value.
Then you get a bun fight at the federal provincial table. So that's why I'm looking for something innovative. Like, we can have a mineral exploration tax credit that applies across the country. Why not something similar? A tax credit of some kind.
Actually, the thought partner that Senator Black and I know really well, I guess probably shouldn't give his name away here in case he's not ready, but a tax credit in terms of zero-till practice, nobody loves a tax credit more than farmers. We don't have to pay them for this and just say, we recognize as a government that you've done this practice for 20 years and there's a credit in that. If you can measure it and it shows up on my tax forms. Oh, I want to give the person credit who seeded the idea, but I don't know if I should at this point. He will know.
Well, it does make a lot of sense, a tax credit for this, and it's not, because again, farmers are concerned about the carbon tax credit coming down the pipe, right? And we're all getting it on our energy bills now, and they're looking for some offset for that, for the good work they've done. It doesn't have to be a check. It could be a tax credit. But, there's other activities that could find their way onto an exchange. I do think some kind of a government-backed exchange, though, we could lead that globally. We really could. I'm certain of it.
But would it penalize other jurisdictions that through no fault of our own, we're releasing this?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I got to really think, I got to think on that one quite a bit to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for Senator Simon's question, and then we'll ask Senator Klein and Senator Deakin to ask your question and hope for responses.
I want to talk about grasslands. We've talked about no-till farming, but in Alberta and Saskatchewan, there are also people trying to develop carbon trading markets for the preservation of natural grasslands and for turning marginal land back to forage. I know that's not directly what you do, but how would you see incorporating that into a carbon trading scheme?
We do a little bit of that work. To me, it seems rather simple. It's you come back to the principles of permanence and additionality, and so it's about demonstrating and being able to measure how much carbon was either not lost or captured. And so to me, it's back to one of the gaps in the industry is how do we measure? The challenge with the grasslands, it's from a volume perspective, the Canadian grassland story is rather unique, and so it's hard to find good data. So there's a data gap doing that well with confidence. but we're working on it as an industry.
The ranchers that I've been speaking with have been working with Texas to try to find a market that works for them. But it seems to me you've got a twofold problem. I mean, how do you give credit to somebody for not ripping up an indigenous grassland that's been there for 5,000 years versus crediting someone for taking what had been a marginal canola field and putting it back to forage?
Protocol is within 60 miles, if there's a farmed land, that's eligible for avoided conversion protocol from CAR, the Climate Action Reserve. They're actually modernizing that protocol as we speak for Southwest Saskatchewan.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Wow, okay. Then we have time for Senator Klein's question.
I don't know if we have time for an answer. We'll get the question in and you can provide the answer. Okay. So,
Marty asked meaty questions.
meaty questions, yeah. I'm going to forget the preamble. I was going to ask Mr. Seymour earlier for 101 on the carbon market. I don't think we should take it for granted that everybody understands the carbon market. There's buyers and sellers. What's in it for each? What are they looking for? And what's the benefits? And the bottom line is, how does this contribute to climate change and moving us closer to net zero? That's one area. Second area is, as you've related or you include on some of your statements and website included, that First Nations in Canada have sovereignty over 150 million acres of land, and Senator Simons would be pleased to know that that includes farms, grasslands, and forests that naturally take in carbon. And you did state in an interview once before that although Indigenous people have always worked on protecting the environment, they haven't been given a fair opportunity to participate in the carbon market. So what are the barriers there? What are the solutions to overcome the barriers and get them fully engaged in the carbon market? And then the third area I would ask would be on expand on this role of government in terms of everything from, I'll work for the bottom up, validation, the financing, additionality principles, and you talked about the money has to change the behavior and what data you might have behind to support that. And the carbon protocol development, I'd like to hear more of that. And they facilitate the role of government again, this is all under that. The last one, facilitate the voluntary adoption.
So you have those questions, and you can actually watch the testimony and get them again. Senator Deakin, you have time for a question, not the answer.
I understand that, Chair. Thank you very much for your gracious offer. If you were to get together with others in the space, that maybe competitors, collaborators, and be presenting us with very clear direction as to where we need to focus. One of them could be just literally defining the marketplace, what it looks like, what are the variables that need to be managed. We've talked about soil being considered a natural resource in this country. It would make me, Jonathan Wilkinson really got this, but he was at ECCC. Unfortunately, I haven't found anybody who does since at AAFC or ECCC. So if you can help us in any way get very specific, especially as a group of companies, I think it would be very helpful to us to know how to push harder and further and more explicitly, because the dream you put forward is a dream that I share for sure, and I think others around this table do.
Thank you. So you have some homework cut out for you, our witnesses, Mr. Mann, Ms. Hoare, and Mr. Seymour. If you wish to present back to us in written format, we would welcome that, and you can send that to our clerk. I want to say thanks for your participation, and thanks for your passion. It shone today, and we really do appreciate it. It's a long-term study, and your assistance has been very much appreciated. So, colleagues, we have our witnesses online, and so we're going to just transition. We will ask our in-person witnesses to just leave the room, and our clerk will welcome you out. But we can just carry on, quite frankly, just moving right into our next panel. Thank you, folks. Senator Klein? Oh, question.
Get me on the list.
So,
I'm ready to go.
colleagues,